Hello, welcome. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Strategic Programs at Illuminate. Thank you so much for joining us from all over the world. Illuminate is a hub for Jewish activism, leadership, and philanthropy, the donors and the doers. We are fueled by our shared determination to create a more just and equitable world in which all people are afforded the resources and opportunities to achieve their dreams. One of our signature initiatives, The Collective, is an active, ongoing community where visionary entrepreneurs and leaders collaborate and offer each other strategic support and advice. We nurture these transformational women leaders. We call them jewels, Jewish, entrepreneurial, women, executives, and leaders, by providing them with financial resources, fostering relationships, and offering educational opportunities that both inform and inspire. This cadre of multi-generational women tackle a broad range of issues affecting women and other marginalized populations throughout the United States, Israel, and around the globe. Welcome back to our Crown Jewel Conversation Series. This monthly series gives us the opportunity to learn from and interact with these bold and creative leaders. We believe that the integration of activism and philanthropy is essential for creating social change, and that greater impacts can be made when philanthropists and leaders intersect to create a true partnership. These relationships are vital, deserving, and in need of nourishment, inspiration, and elevation. It is not only about financial resources, but also about intellectual and spiritual generosity. When women step forward to solve big problems, history can be made. We are all visionaries, whether we are the doers or the donors. We are the antidote to despair, frustration, and anxiety. Alone, we are a drop in the ocean. Together, we are a wave of change. When you support Illuminate, you are not only supporting 40 organizations, soon to be 50, run by phenomenal Jewish women, you are supporting a movement. Our conversation today will allow you to get to know one of these incredible women in this movement. Rabbi Jennie Rosenn is the founder and CEO of Dayenu, a new organization mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. Jennie has spent more than 2 decades leading Jewish nonprofit organizations, advocating for social change and creating dynamic new initiatives at the heart of the Jewish social justice movement. Before founding Dayenu, she served as the vice president for community engagement of Hayes, where she built a robust Jewish movement responding to the global refugee crisis. Jennie is a founding board member of Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, and Repair the World, and on the boards of the Jewish Funders Network and New York Jobs with Justice. She was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she was a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She has twice been named one of the Forward 50's most influential Jews in America. If, like Jennie and Illuminate, you want to secure a just, livable, and sustainable world for all people for generations to come, then you're in the right place today. After the conversation, we will open the floor for questions. Feel free to write your questions in the chat or hold them and you'll have the chance to ask them later on. For now, we will be muting all participants to avoid any background noise, but we encourage you to turn on your camera.
Rachel, I think you got muted there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We heard you say turn on your camera so we can see your beautiful faces.
Turn on your camera. Feel free to eat your breakfast, lunch, dinner, wherever you are with us while you listen. And now I am pleased to turn this over to Rachel Weinstein, our president at Illuminate.
Thank you, Rachel. Jennie, it's so great to be in conversation with you today. What an extraordinary resume. truly, and such a privilege to be supporting you in your work. Just as the Torah starts with Breshit, with creation, we love to start these conversations with origin stories of the organizations that our fabulous jewels have found. So let's start with the beginning. How did Dayenu come to be, and what led you to found the organization?
First of all, I just want to say it's wonderful to be here. It's such a treat in the middle of the day to be able to sit with a whole group of powerful women. So thank you for this opportunity. So I became a rabbi, and as you heard, have worked for 2 decades, really mobilizing the American Jewish community around issues of social and economic justice. And that for me had always meant things related to people, poverty, immigrants and refugees. And I sort of thought, I think like many people do, of like the environment is a little bit out there. I liked hiking. I gave money to, environmental organizations. But I wasn't viscerally connected. And this really started to change for me. I think I started reading reports of the climate crisis and realizing it was coming much faster and more furiously than I had realized, which terrified me. I realized that this is happening in my lifetime, let alone my children and grandchildren. And at the time, as you heard, I was working at HIAS and hearing the stories of refugees and witnessing their pain and imagining what 1 billion climate refugees, which is the number experts are predicting. It's sort of unfathomable. And I think the last piece to my awakening to the climate crisis was just a relatively minor weather experience in San Francisco. A number of years ago, there was a heat wave. San Francisco is not set up for heat waves, and the city just completely shut down. It felt kind of apocalyptic. And during that time, I was also coming to realize that the climate crisis is a social, economic, and racial justice issue. It's about who's bearing the brunt of the climate crisis already and who's going to be most severely impacted. So as I was sort of integrating the reality of what it means to live in this moment of climate emergency, I was also having conversations with friends and colleagues about how the American Jewish community wasn't fully mobilizing its people in power to confront the climate crisis in an organized, national, systemic approach at the scale that's needed. This is the existential issue of our time, and for a variety of reasons, the Jewish community was not really fully showing up. So I founded Dayenu 2.5 years ago, really to build a movement of Jews across communities and across generations, working together and together with other communities to confront the climate crisis, as you heard from Rachel Siegel, with spiritual audacity and bold political action. And I'm curious, I imagine that many of you have your own stories of awakening to the climate crisis, either long ago or more recently. And I'm curious, just by like a show of hands, how many of you are more concerned about the climate crisis now than you were, say, 5 years ago? Yeah. I think that there is really a collective awakening and a collective reckoning with what does that mean? What does that mean for each of us as we live in this time? So it's just a little bit about what brought me to this work.
Yeah. So interesting. And I'd love to delve a little bit deeper, right, into how you're going about creating this movement and how you do what you do. But first, maybe we should start with the what you do. So can you talk a little bit about, Dayenu's programming and what is the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So, so many of you just raised your hands. And indeed, the research shows that more than 80% of American Jews are concerned about the climate crisis, or very concerned. And it's actually a top issue among Jewish voters. But most are not taking meaningful action. They may be changing some of their personal practices, but I think there's a reason that more people, I think there are 2 reasons actually why more people aren't engaging. The first is that it's hard to know what to do to make a difference in the face of such a large and complex issue. And the second reason is I think it can be hard to face the truth of what's at stake on an emotional and psychological level. It's almost like too much to take in. So we disassociate, or we turn away, or we distract ourselves. So we launched Dayenu really to address both of these reasons and to give American Jews pathways to take meaningful strategic action at the scale that both science and justice require. And also to support Jews and Jewish communities to face and move through the anxiety and the angst and the pain of the climate crisis. So what are we doing? We are mobilizing Jewish support for climate solutions. We're building our collective power with national and global movements, and we're raising up a spiritual, religious, and moral voice. So what does this look like on the ground? We are developing and training and resourcing a growing network of Dayenu circles across the country. These are small grassroots groups coming up in hillels and synagogues and neighborhoods. There are about 100 in different stages of formation. And these are Jews of every kind of age and background taking action on climate. We have training, we're training hundreds of young Jews between the ages of 18 and 32 in Jewish climate organizing through our program we call Taking Down Goliath. Beyond the organizing on the grassroots level, we also partner with organizations, hundreds of Jewish organizations, secular climate groups where Jews aren't always showing up, and coalitions and other faith communities to really ensure that the Jewish community is bringing its voice and people to the collective work. And then we're designing strategic campaigns for Dayenu circles and young people and Jewish organizational partners to take action and to really move the needle in a big way. So we helped to pass the historic Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest investment in clean energy ever in the United States. We are electing, we ran two recently, Chutzpah 2020 and Chutzpah 2022, which are our Get Out the Vote efforts, nonpartisan, to really bring out climate voters and to help elect leaders who are bold on climate. We are standing in solidarity with frontline communities who are most directly impacted, and we're fighting to keep fossil fuels in the ground and unburned. And finally, I'll just add, we know that the climate crisis is not only a social, ecological, political issue, it's also an issue of the soul. And so Dayenu is building a spiritually rooted Jewish climate movement, and that means Jewish resources for Jews and Jewish communities to be able to confront the crisis really with their hearts and eyes open, but supported by Jewish tradition and faith, and teaching and music, and of course, community, because it all comes back to doing this work in community.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I mean, it sounds like you're really working at the advocacy policy level of galvanizing people and movements. And you said something really interesting in your sort of introduction about it being the climate change being a social justice issue, and you referred to the people who it affects. And so can you talk a little bit more about that and how you're going about trying to make systemic change in that arena?
Yeah. So I think about the climate crisis as like something that magnifies inequities. It's like a force multiplier. So the climate crisis really rests disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized. So these are people living in the global South, in poverty, in particular vulnerable areas, in our country, people who experience racism and other kinds of bigotry. It's like the climate crisis exacerbates these historic inequities. And at the same time, it impacts everyone, right? It's justice and equity are so essential to confronting the crisis. I think about it a little bit like the early days of the coronavirus, where it affected all of us, but it was particularly hard hitting in more vulnerable communities. And so I think it's important to hold both of those, that the climate crisis doesn't affect us all equally, and no one's going to be exempt from it. I will also say that those who are most impacted generally have contributed least to the problem. And that's both on a global scale and within the United States. So what it means to keep that in mind as we do this work and center justice is that as we're building solutions, as I would say, fighting the bad and building the good, we need to make sure that communities that are on the front lines, that are most impacted, that have drilling and pipelines in their backyards, for whom pollution and higher rates of asthma and more flooding, that they're part of the decision-making process as we do this work, that we follow their lead. And also that as we roll out the transition to clean energy, which is what is a central part of what needs to happen, that it's distributed in a way that really centers equity and justice. So those are a few examples of both, what that means to say it's a social, economic, and racial justice issue, and also what that means in terms of how we approach it.
Yeah, so interesting. And you also use the term, that your work is spiritually rooted. So I'd love to hear a little bit more exactly about what that means and how it manifests itself in your work.
Yeah, so it's such a good question. So obviously, a lot of our work is mobilizing communities to take action, right? To take action at scale, to take strategic action, to come together and build collective power to do that. But we also, what we call it our work in spiritual adaptation, because in climate, you talk about mitigation and adaptation. What do we need to mitigate and what do we need to adapt? So we think about this as spiritual adaptation. What do we need to do to live with spiritual integrity and alignment and hope in this time of crisis? So, as I mentioned earlier, the climate crisis isn't just a political issue, it's also really deeply painful on a soul level, for lack of a better word. So we are really trying to support, again, Jews and Jewish communities to grapple with this, not to hide the ball as a Jewish community, but to acknowledge that on an existential, emotional, spiritual, for some people, religious level, this is part of what it means to live as a Jew in the 21st century, to live as a human being in the 21st century. So how do we, the work that we do sort of rooted in Jewish history, we've certainly been a people that has faced annihilation many times throughout history, rooted in Jewish experience and teaching and tradition and faith and increasingly song. How do we act from those places? And so we are working really to provide ways for people to do that, spaces where folks can acknowledge those feelings of fear and anxiety, for some people guilt, for some people anger, to cultivate a sense of hope, and really to move into courageous action. So we created and run a set of workshops that are particularly on this focus, giving people that space to do that. That's kind of in the concentrated form. And then more broadly, we integrate this into everything we do. So any actions often have a ritual element, a musical element. We develop and share a lot of climate Torah, and increasingly Jewish climate music and arts. So these are all sort of spiritual modalities to support people in this work. And I think that there's, I guess I'll just sort of end in responding to this question, that I think there's great power in spiritually rooted activism. It's not just about tactics. And Dayenu is really building a movement that is deeply rooted in the community and the spirit that we need to orient us, that we need to ground us, and that we need to sustain us in this, what I think of as really hard and holy work.
Yeah, and it sounds like the work that you do and the communities you're building, right? It's a unifier, right? We're all experiencing climate change, obviously some people more than others, but this shared purpose and this shared desire to make sure that this world is around in a way that we can all enjoy going forward, it really unites the community, which is a really beautiful thing. And to bring in, the Jewish spirituality around it, I think is really meaningful. Who is it that you are engaging in your work? Who would you say it mostly is? I know you talked about the workshops that you run for younger people, 18 to 32. Are you largely engaging younger people, or are you crossing, who exactly is participating with you?
So we are engaging younger people, and we're engaging boomers and Gen Xers. We're really, from the get-go, it's very clear to me when I was thinking about how to conceptualize Dayenu that this needs to be a multi-generational movement. This is for that 80% of American Jews who are concerned about the climate crisis but don't know what to do. And that means everything from college students and 20-somethings to JCC moms who are concerned about their children's futures, from baby boomer Jews in the pews, to young activists who are already engaged in climate but aren't really sure the Jewish community is relevant to them. And so it's really across that whole spectrum. We also think about how do we mobilize Jewish individuals and Jewish communities and Jewish institutions. And I will say that building something multi-generational and also multiracial. We just had an amazing program last night with the Jews of Color Initiative as we really work to build a multiracial Jewish climate movement. It's hard. It's hard. There's a reason, for example, why most organizations and movements are not intergenerational. I actually think Illuminate is an exception to the rule. And now that I think about it, most movements and organizations are not multi-generational. And yet this, is a fundamental part of how we think about the work. I think not only does it affect us all, but it also affects us differently. Like, I think different generations are experiencing the climate crisis and like metabolizing it in somewhat different ways. I don't want to overly generalize, but I think there's an older generation that feels fear and anxiety, but also some guilt about leaving this world as it is, and ways that their generations contributed to this. I think there's a generation that's really my generation. I'm like an old Gen Xer who didn't necessarily grow up with this and sort of had this awakening, and also was like, wait, the world's not what we thought it was. Like, we were raised on this idea that things keep getting better and better. You just sort of keep working for greater and greater. And like, it's a challenge to our understanding of the world. And I think for younger generations, Rachel and I were just talking about, we have, young adult children, and certainly younger, this is all they've known. This is the world they were born into. And I think they're often taking the lead around climate, and many of them are also angry. And so all of which is to say, this is a vast generalization, but I think different generations are experiencing different. Certainly Jews of color are experiencing it in a different way than white Jews. And I think it's really important that we create spaces for, and so we have Dayenu circles, for example, that are multi-generational, but many of our Dayenu circles are like mostly boomers, let's say, or at a Hillel, mostly young people. Mm-hmm. And what we find is then as we have campaigns like Hear the Call campaign to pass the IRA, or the All Our Might campaign to keep fossil fuels in the ground, in those big moments, they come together to work on those public actions. And so part of our work is also helping them to work well together, and to understand that there are times to sort of be with your people, and then there are times really to weave together. Because at the center of this, right at the center of the climate crisis and the world we're building is really this concept of living l'dor v'dor, of living generation to generation. And so it becomes so important that we weave together a movement that really is for everyone.
Yes, 100%. I love that. I'm getting a few questions from some of our listeners, and I encourage anyone who has questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat, or as Rachel said, we can open it up at the end. Where does most of your funding come from?
Our funding is a combination of foundations and individuals. Mm-hmm. We have a few major individuals. We have a growing number of, we would consider like mid-level donors and grassroots donors. Most of the foundation support is from Jewish foundations. I will say that in the last year, we've started to get funding from two secular climate foundations, which felt like a real turning point, because it felt like a way of being like that. This isn't just nice for the Jewish community. We're actually really contributing to the larger climate movement, and are really looking at this point to really grow our funder base of individuals, so that we're not quite so foundation heavy. Yeah, to diversify.
And I think you mentioned earlier one of the bills that you were instrumental in passing. Maybe you could just elaborate on that and maybe share some of other examples of how your advocacy has manifested itself.
Yeah. So when we launched in April of 2020, which was an unexpected time to launch an organization in the early days of the pandemic, and we knew we couldn't wait. We launched around what was then sort of this idea of a just green recovery. How are we going to rebuild our world, our economy, our infrastructure in a way that is just and a way that is green? And that became what you may remember, Build Back Better. And we had at that time 16 public actions, people, Dayenu circles organizing together with other organizations in 16 locations across the country where folks showed up with shofarot out on the doorsteps of their senators' offices and calling for them to support a just green recovery and to be bold on climate. And actually Schumer came to our action in Brooklyn, which was a big deal. And he went on the record making some commitments that he hadn't made before. And that then continued sort of from there, a lot of work in the background, continuing to keep pressure on a few key people, including Schumer. And then over time, that became the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we then held a big multi-faith gathering, again, to try to hold our leaders accountable around in the spring, that also kind of tied in what was happening in Ukraine. It was a moral call for peace and justice and climate action. And then ran a bunch of also ads kind of behind the scenes, keeping the pressure up on some key senators. And meanwhile, our Dayenu circles were meeting with their folks. And all of this really, listen, we're one part of a larger movement, and we have real indications that what we contributed really mattered to the efforts to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, perhaps the worst named bill ever, which is the largest investment in clean energy. I believe $370 billion that will enable us now to get not all the way, but part of the way to net zero emissions well before 2050. I will say, and you may have heard a little bit about this, that at the same time, there was a side deal that was made with Manchin. You might have remembered the kind of roller coaster with the bill and Manchin, which was a really bad side deal. It's called the dirty deal among activists. And we also, in addition to really working and celebrating the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, immediately started working as an ally to frontline communities who were trying to stop, for example, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So this is on the other side of things, pipelines that are still being built in people's backyards and in mostly poor people's backyards. So Dayenu's work is kind of both, that's a snapshot of kind of the allyship on the front lines and also really playing a role in passing major legislation. I will say, it happened on Tisha B'Av, actually. The passage of the House was on Tisha B'Av, and it was actually read on the Senate floor, some of our Torah around Tisha B'Av and the passage of the IRA. And that was really a moment for us in terms of kind of bringing Jewish voice and narrative into the work as well.
That's extraordinary. That's amazing. And it's amazing what you've been able to accomplish in less than 3 years, inclusive of a pandemic. I mean,
Yes.
it's really extraordinary. So with the prognosis for our world, seemingly dire every day, how do you envision success, both from that 30,000 foot level of success for the climate change movement and also for your organization? So I guess it's a two-pronged question.
So on some level, the climate crisis is really complicated. And in some ways, it's kind of simple, which is we need to keep temperatures from rising above 2 degrees Celsius, which is what scientists tell us we need to do to reach net zero well before 2050. And that's not going to stop everything, but it's going to help us avert the worst and the kind of tumbling effects. And in order to do that, we need to do 2 things. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and unburned and stop emitting. And we need to build and shift to a clean energy system. And we need to do that quickly, and we need to do that at scale. And so that means, among other things, that people need to not only think about their personal practices, but how we can all become part of making that systemic change. Because are just doing our day-to-day practices, which I think are really important. I think they're important in terms of how we're transitioning our lives. I think they're important on a personal, spiritual level, but it's not actually going to move the needle enough. And the statistic that I think shows this well is if you think back to the early days of the pandemic, everyone was talking about like how much emissions had fallen. In reality, they fell 7%. This is when everyone was homebound, because the other 93% are really embedded in our infrastructure and economy. And so systemic change means things like advocating for comprehensive climate policy on the federal level, and now on the state level. That's kind of the next stage after the IRA, what's happening on the states. It means cutting the demand and supply for fossil fuel, which actually means also stopping the money for supporting the fossil fuel industry and moving money away from them. It means building a movement, and it means changing our political landscape. Bill McKibben, who some of you may know, is a climate journalist and activist. He has a quote, which I just love. He says, "The climate crisis no longer yields to individual actions. There's no way to make the math work one vegan dinner or Tesla at a time." At this point, the most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join movements sharp enough to make change. So it's not just like, what car do I buy, but like what cars are being manufactured? It's not just where do I bank, but what are the biggest banks in the world investing in fossil fuel? So what needs to happen, and we really have, they tell us the next 7 years, which is a kind of scary number. This is our time for action, is to engage in that kind of systemic change and to build a movement, a Jewish movement that's part of a larger movement. And to know also that we don't have to do this alone. Like when it starts to feel really overwhelming, there are, and I think Dayenu circles are a great example of sort of doing this in community. And there are groups of people, across the country working on climate action with a Jewish voice and in partnership with other groups and with frontline communities. And we really see our role at Dayenu of supporting those circles, training and coaching and resources and campaigns. So success is building this collective power of the Jewish climate movement, this collective power of the larger climate movement, and really bringing our full people in power to address this, and supporting people Jewishly and the Jewish community in that process. Organizationally, so we have an amazing staff team. I feel like Dayenu is just draws from the climate movement, from Jewish environmental, from movement building, from Jewish social justice. And we have, I feel, done a lot in a short period of time, as you said, Rachel. And we have a vision and ambitions for more, and there's a lot of momentum. And so success in many ways is building on that momentum, which, and I feel a little funny saying this, but I really think this is the answer to your question, which is that we need to raise enough money to really be able to build on that momentum. So for example, our organizing team is like 3 people who are doing all of the organizing of all of these Dayenu circles and all of the resourcing and all of the training and all of the campaigns and everything. We have 1 person doing all of our spiritual resource development. We have 1 amazing development professional, Libby Bearbreen, who's on here. But if we're really going to be able to go to the next scale, we don't even have a communications director. Like we really need to be able to gather that momentum. And so I think success for the organization is continuing all of the good that we've built and really being able to take it to the next level.
Amazing. And you sort of touched on the question that was asked here in the chat, just a little bit about your team. I mean, you started to name some of the departments. How big is your team in total? And sort of what are their profiles and what are their backgrounds? Have they been always working in climate change as well?
Yeah. So we have a team of 11. We started with 1 and then 2 and then 4 and then 8. And as of the summer, we're 11. And they really draw from lots of different worlds. So our chief strategy officer, Phil Aranyanu, comes from the climate movement. He's a son of Romanian Jews, hadn't worked in the Jewish community before, was one of the co-founders of 350, and really comes from the climate movement. Dalia Rockowitz, who's our Washington director, comes from both Jewish. She'd worked at, she was in Avodah, she worked at American Jewish World Service for many years, and then really got turned on to climate, went and got a master's degree in climate justice at Michigan, and then went to work for Climate Reality, Al Gore's, so a secular climate organization, and then came to us. So she really comes from Jewish and climate. Nati Passau, our director of finance and operations, comes very much from the Jewish environmental world. He used to run the Jewish farm school. So people, that's sort of a snapshot of really drawing from all of those different, all those different worlds.
That's great. I love this question. Someone asked about your role models. Who have been your role models? And as a second part to that question, were there any specific books that were written that you read that inspired you? And if you'd share those with us.
Great question. So I'm going to name 3 role models. So growing up, what really called me into the rabbinate, actually 4, what really called me into the rabbinate were 3 people. Martin Luther King and Gandhi, for whom kind of social change and social justice work really came out of religious roots, and as religious leaders leading from that place of faith, and leading powerful social justice movements from there. I used to have a big picture of Gandhi on my wall growing up. When I look back on I'd wanted to be a rabbi since I was 14. And when I look back at why 14, I also remember that we went to visit my mom's best friend in college, who was an Episcopalian priest. And I saw her administering midnight mass, and she was the first female clergy person I ever met. So kind of early on, I would say those 3, that trio. In terms of kind of more modern day, it's actually Ruth Messenger, who I think about every day, as a champion and a warrior, and a leader. And in terms of books, I would highly recommend All We Can Save, which is an amazing, and put it in the chat, an amazing book of essays that is very honest and raw and also inspiring.
Amazing. One of our staff can maybe put a link.
Thank you.
For us. What inspiring role models, and Ruth Messenger is a shero for all of us. For those of you who might be less familiar with Illuminate or joining us for the first time, Ruth Messenger is also one of our key consultants for the collective, and she has very much been a part of designing the curriculum and leading our collective through the curriculum, and being just a general fabulous mentor resource for all. So Ruth, I'm not sure if you're on here, but thank you. I just have a couple closing questions, but there's one more, I think, some questions about what Dayenu circles are, and, and how also you're working on university campuses. And maybe it's one of the same, because maybe there are Dayenu circles on campuses, but I think fleshing that out a little would be helpful.
So Dayenu circles are a small group of people who come together and decide we want to take climate action in a Jewish context. Some of those are in synagogues. We started in the pandemic. It's interesting. So we pictured it being like people's living rooms, but no one was going to anyone's living room. So they really took form in communities that were already established in some way. So synagogues or Hillels. I will say there's some in neighborhoods, like there's a Washington Heights Dayenu Circle that is a neighborhood Dayenu Circle. And so it's generally a core group, and then they organize from there, larger circles of people. And Dayenu has a whole set of resources to help Dayenu circle leaders. I would say many of these people have never been activists before, have never engaged in this way. They're coming off the sidelines as we kind of think about it. So our amazing organizing team runs trainings, runs office hours and coaching. Whenever we have a campaign, which they then engage on, like these, one example, the public actions, or get out the vote with chutzpah, we have a whole toolkit that we develop and kind of a roadmap for them. And then we also connect Dayenu circles with each other, so that it's really becoming more and more of a network. And yes, college campuses is an area where actually we have some Dayenu circles, and we're doing more and more and more work there. I just spoke at the HIGA, I don't know what it stands for. It's the big conference of all the Hillel professionals, Hillel International General Assembly, I'm not sure. And there's a lot of interest on campuses. And we have a designated young person organizer. And one of the new hires we're hoping to make in the new year is another organizer just focused on young people.
Amazing. They're so powerful, as we know. So you have been in the collective now for a year and a half. How has being part of the collective impacted your leadership, and how are you leveraging the relationships that you have found there?
So I think when I interviewed, there might be folks on this call who were there, I think I told the committee that I was not looking to do a startup in my early 50s. My husband actually started Avodah when we were in our 30s, in our living room, and I saw what that took. And I was at the Nathan Cummings Foundation as a program officer for about 10 years and funded a lot of startups. And I knew that it was not something to do lightly. And I also knew that it took thick skin, which I don't have. And I asked myself, like, am I up for this? And I thought, no, I do not have thick skin. I am not up for this. And then I thought, but I need to do this. Like, I have been working to mobilize American Jews. That's been my rabbinate. That's why I became a rabbi. And here is the existential issue of our time. We're not fully mobilized. I have to do this. We're living in a time where we all need to do uncomfortable things. And it's hard. It's incredibly rewarding. And it's exactly what I should be doing. And it's really hard. And having colleagues through the collective is the most valuable thing. Other women who are starting things, who are leading things, who are making social change and dealing with issues, both kind of in what it takes to build an organization, what it takes to lead, and what it takes to make big social change in the larger world. And so it's just, I can't say enough how much that is the power of being part of a collective and a network of women leading organizations. I just, minutes before there's a chat, and sometimes it's very tachlis, very specific. Someone said, I need a PR firm and I got a proposal that was $15,000 and that's ridiculous. And, somebody else wrote in and said, oh, use this person, right? So it's like on that level. And then it's on the, we had that gathering a few months ago, and it was really a chance for people to kind of sit with everything they're dealing with on a deeper level and share that. And that's really incredibly powerful.
That's really beautiful. And I love what you said, that we're in a time where we all need to be a bit uncomfortable. And I guess having a space where you can be vulnerable and feel supported at the same time is really rare. So I'm glad that can be a place for you. I guess my last question, and before we take any others, is, why Dayenu? Why did you name your organization Dayenu? Our favorite song from Passover.
Favorite song,
of course, right?
So it's the joyous song we sing at Passover, right? That tells the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. And it recounts all the things that God did for us, right? God had taken us out of Egypt, but not given us the Torah. Dayenu, it would have been enough. Give us the Torah. So usually we understand it as like, it would have been enough. But it also means we've had enough, right? We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough letting the impacts of climate crisis fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, Indigenous people, like Dayenu. And here's where the double entendre comes in, because it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources, we have the policy rubrics, we have the technology, we have what we need so that everyone can have enough. And so we named the organization Dayenu really to reflect both of those things, the urgency and the real possibility that is still there for us to take up.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Jennie. Thank you for spending this time with me. I want to invite Rachel Siegel back on. It's such a pleasure learning about your work. I'm going to investigate Dayenu circles in my neighborhood. It sounds like it's really easy. You know, if those
It's
of
really
you
easy.
on here care about the environment, you have a book club, it sounds as easy as starting a book club. So I think we should all consider that, especially at this moment around Tu B'Shvat, when we are thinking about our world and how we as Jews are going to make sure that it thrives. So thank you again. Rachel, I'm turning it over to you.
Wonderful to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Jennie, for taking this time to share your wisdom and your extraordinary story with us. And I love your explanation of the name. And also thank you for your participation in the collective. We learn so much from you all the time. Thank you, Rachel, for leading us in this conversation. Jennie, we don't have to hope that things will be different when we have leaders like you to guide us in the United States, all around the world. We actually believe that it can happen. We're so inspired by Jennie's leadership and her extraordinary story, and we hope that you are as well. If you've been with us before, you know that we always like to share a few actions that you can take. Jennie mentioned a lot of them. We hope that you will sign up for Dayenu's newsletter, follow them on social media so that you can keep in touch with their work, start a Dayenu circle of your own, advocate for ending the use of fossil fuels, and many more. We'll email all of these out to you tomorrow. We offer these crown jewel conversation sessions at no cost to you, but if you find value in what we're doing, we hope that you will consider 2 donations today. One to Dayenu and one to Illuminate. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, we hope you'll join us next month on March 2nd, where we'll hear from another incredible member of the collective. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you very soon. Be well. Take care, everyone.